Okay, so yesterday we had outlined basically three main ways that you could approach a case in which a biblical value is instantiated into rabbinic law. I will note that there are most Rishonim assume the Dina D'Bar Metzra as we have it is D'Rabbanan. There are some Rishonim that seem to imply otherwise, but I honestly don't know whether they really mean it's D'Oraita or they just mean what everyone else means, which is that it's a D'Rabbanan law which reflects a D'Oraita value. So let's just assume, for our purposes, that that's what it is, right? An overarching D'Oraita value that is expressed rabbinically. So we said there's really three ways you could do it. One is descriptively, which is to say there really isn't a rabbinic law at all. It's just that the rabbis choose to articulate a particular expression of the biblical value, but they're not actually adding anything to it except, right, specifying that this is, in fact, a fulfillment of that biblical value. But it's not law, it's still at that layer of spirit of the law. Then they can choose to formalize it into law, right? Add a layer of technicality to it, right? To a real formal law to it. But within that, they can still take two directions. One is to say this is law and it functions like normal law, where the motivation is independent from the actual structure of the law, or they can choose to implement it as law, but somewhere in between, right? A law that is constantly answerable, as it were, to the guiding principle upon which it was based. So we started with the Gemara, where we note that the Gemara first introduces the case of achzik b'nei achei, right? That's someone who buys property between brothers or partners, which is, problematic, as the Gemara calls it, chatzifa. And the Gemara says, okay, given that it's problematic to, actively go and buy a property that interrupts the property between brothers, where there was an assumption that they would be able to buy it and have a contiguous property, but can you, if someone goes ahead and buys it, can you kick them off? And as we'll see, Dina D'Bar Metzra, as much as we've talked about it from the vantage point of the seller, most of the halachic discussion is actually from the vantage point of the buyer, right? The buyer who's not neighbors or not whatever, who chooses to insert himself into this real estate situation. So the Gemara introduces that case, and then introduces the case of Dina D'Bar Metzra. In the first case, you have the anonymous, you have Rav Yehuda Marav saying that you shouldn't insert yourself in between the properties of brothers, but if you do, we can't remove you. And Rav Nachman saying, yes, we can. And then the classic case of Dina D'Bar Metzra, where you have the even Rav Nachman kind of being moda that you do not remove the person, but the Nahardai saying that you do. And what we had suggested yesterday was this question of removal versus not removal is that first question within the rabbinic formulation of the biblical law. If you think they're just describing it, but fundamentally this is just still a values question rather than a law question. So in values, we can tell you you're bad, but it's very hard for us to enforce it. That's not how things work. But if you think we've taken a overarching abstract biblical value and we've codified it into formal law, codify or codify, whatever, what? So then it might also be enforceable. And therefore you could theoretically remove the person from the property. And though, as you see in the Gemara, just because you say one about one law, you don't have to say it for everything. So you have people who say, in the particularly bad case of someone actively inserting himself between brothers and partners, there you could remove him, but maybe not a regular Dina D'Bar Metzra. And then the Nardai saying, no. Even Dina D'Bar Metzra, you can remove the person from the property. So that's what we were up to. Okay, so let's pick up there in the Gemara. Who wants to continue in the Gemara? From the second wide line on Kochet Amud Aleph, and Ata Imlech Bey. No one wants to volunteer. Okay. What? Continuing in the Gemara in Bava Metzia, where we were yesterday. Okay, so what happens? Ata Imlech Bey. What if somebody comes and asks, Amar le Ezel Azbin. So this time, who is it again? Yehonatan is the neighbor? You're the neighbor? Who is the neighbor? You were the neighbor or Ezra was the neighbor?
I think I was the neighbor.
Good, okay. So Ezra comes to Yonatan and says, Yo, can I go buy that field? He asked Yonatan first. And what do you say? Let's act this out. Zil Zvon. What does that mean? Zil Zvon is go buy. Go ahead. So the Gemara then asks, Sarah lemikne olo. In order to gain the right to do that, does Ezra have to make a kinyan with Yo or not? Meaning, is Yonatan just saying, yeah, go ahead and buy, is that enough? And now Ezra, his conscience is clean, he can go buy it, and now if tomorrow Yonatan comes back and says, Mapitom, I want to buy it, we say, too bad. Or, no, even if Yoho told Ezra, go ahead and buy it. Tomorrow Yonatan can come and say, nope, I want it, give it to me. And the only way that we could stop him from doing that is if you actually made a kinyan. You actually did a legal, transactional act to concretize the Yonatan's commitment to let Ezra go ahead and buy it and not take it and not take advantage of his rights as the Bar Metzra. So, what do you think? What's the and then the Gemara says Machlokas. Ravina Amar Lo Tzarech LeMiknei Minei Nardai Amri Tzarech LeMiknei Minei V'Hilchatza Tzarech LeMiknei Minei. Right, the Machloket. Do you need that kinyan or not? And we paskin you do. That as long as Yonatan hasn't engaged in a formal transaction to give over his rights to Ezra, tomorrow he can turn around and say, I was just kidding. I want it. It's mine. What? A kinyan is the way we formalize a deal. Say it again? Yeah. Yeah. Ezra is asking permission from Yonatan. Ezra is asking permission from Yonatan to go buy it. So, how do you explain this machlokas? Tzarech l'miknei minei or lo tzarech l'miknei minei? So one possibility is basically the exact same way we talked about before, right? Which is, if you think that this isn't law, this is values, so then, if Ezra goes to Yonatan and says, do you want the field? You have rights to it. Do you want it? And Yonatan says, no. It's okay, go ahead. And then Ezra goes and buys it. So, did Ezra do anything wrong? No, right? But if you think that Chazal actually formalized this value into law, so then you might argue that, okay, maybe morally Ezra didn't do anything wrong, but what can we do? At this point, Dina D'Bar Metzra is a law in the books, and whenever you have a law in the books, in order to deal with it, it's not just enough to say, yeah, go ahead, right? You need to sign a contract. You need to you need to do something that is recognizable in court. So it could be that this question of the Gemara is exactly parallel to the previous question, and just like in the previous halacha, we paskin misalkinan minei, that we kick you off the land. Here we say that Yonatan only gives up his rights if he formally acquires them bequeaths them to Ezra in a kinyan, and without that, so that's one way. Is there any other possible formulation? I think that's a good formulation. I'm not saying it's a bad formulation. I think it's very plausible that these are just two parallel machlokot that both reflect the same fundamental conceptual question. If we're all happy with it, we can move on. I mean, it really could be, right? I think it's very plausible to say that these two questions are the exact same conceptual point. Now, I think we have to be open to the fact that it might not be, right? It could be that this is a much more quantitative question, which is, maybe it is law, but not in all cases of law do we require the high level of kinyan. So maybe it's a technical question, right? Another way of formulating it, though, is that we might have to dig even farther and say, when we say that Yonatan has a legal right in the field, we can still conceptualize that in two ways, even if we think it's law. Okay? Yeah, Ezra.
Like you say, it's only like the priority that you get, the right that the neighbor gets is only like it comes from the Ita of the Ashar, so like and it's generated. It only exists if he actually wants it. So like just like that, there are other cases where we put them in the lie. So it's in a case in the case where he doesn't want it, it's not just that he's giving up his right. He doesn't have a right. He doesn't want it.
Good. So another possibility is what Ezra says, is to say, no, it is law. But the question is, how do we formulate the law? Is it that if the neighbor wants it, he has a right to it, but once he says he doesn't want it, he loses his right? Or is that, no, he is the presumed buyer until we legally know otherwise? Or I would say it maybe even sharper, and this is the way you find it in some of the Achronim. It's basically what Ezra is saying, but even a stronger thesis. How did we formulate Dina D'Bar Metzra? Did we simply say that the neighbor has the right of first acquisition? Or did we say that we give the neighbor a partial ownership, let's say, in the field? Like, it's not just a right to buy, but it's actually, we give Yonatan a certain right that inheres in the field that he has to give up. Right? That at some level, Dina D'Bar Metzra means he's the moral next owner of this field. And it's not just that he has the right to buy it. It's that he has, by virtue of the fact that he has a moral claim to it, that actually gives him rights in the field. And therefore, in order to lose those rights, it's not just enough to say, I don't want it. Right? So it could be that the question is, what is Dina D'Bar Metzra? Is it a right to acquire or a quasi-moral ownership over the field? Now, if it's the former, so as soon as he says, I don't want it, so he's given up in his rights to buy. But if you say that his moral claim to the field gives him partial ownership in the field, then, in general, simply saying, I don't want the field anymore is not enough. If I say to you, look, I don't want my phone anymore, you can't come and take it, right? That's not enough. I mean, if I say that in front of a bezdin of three and say, I'm masquerade, it works. But if I just say, I don't want it anymore, right, that's not how things work, right? And definitely with a field, right? I can't just say, I don't want my house, right? You don't have a right to take it. I would need to sell it. I need to sign over. Until I do that, it's yours. It's mine. Until I say that it's mine. Yeah. Yes.
If you're gonna say that it's like they have some sort of like ownership of it.
Yeah.
In the case where there's like, let's say like it borders like it borders like 4 fields or something, how does that formulation work? Like do they each have some sort
Presumably, right? Presumably you have to, and again, I'm throwing out different formulations, and I'm
like how it goes.
I will point out that if at any point, at some point you might break my self-control and then make me give you more makaros, until I do that, I'm trying to maintain. So you are correct, right? The question of how to deal with multiple neighbors is one of the questions here, right? Now, but we could talk about it, right? We could say, well, is it when there's multiple neighbors, they all have the right of first acquisition, or they all have ownership, or in case where there's only one neighbor, he has acquisition, but where there's multiple potential neighbors, then it's only right of first acquisition, right? We could come up with all types of permutations of it. So again, I think that it's plausible that the question of kinyan or not is the exact same question as before, right? Meaning, if it's just a moral right, so then Ezra can clear his conscience by asking Yoho, and if Yoho says go ahead, buy it, that's it. But if it's a legal right, formulated based on the Hayasher V'Atov, so until Yoho legally gives up the right to Ezra, it can't be vacated. Or you could say, no, maybe it is legal, but the question is, what is that legal right? Is it a right of first acquisition, or is it some sort of moral claim that inheres in the land itself, which obviously can't be vacated simply by saying go ahead and buy? It has to be vacated and waived through legal mechanisms. Okay. Now, what happens if the Gemara asks, Iyakur Vizo? What happens if it changed price? It was worth more and now it's worth less. Okay? Zovan b'meya v'shavan matayim. Right? So, it changed prices, 100 to 200. So, this is not where it changes. If it changed prices, or Zavan b'meya v'shava matayim, or the seller sold it for less, right? Meaning it's worth 200, but Yaakov sold it to Ezra for 100. So now what's the problem? So now the Gemara says we have a problem, because we've got to figure out what's going on. Because chazina, I lekule alma kol mozilna, v'ilo iarume ka marim. Said, why was he selling it for less? Right? Was that just the price? Right? He decided he wanted to sell it and he just wanted to get rid of it. Right? Right? Or is this part of an elaborate, right, trick? Right? If you look at Rashi, he says, Imbati likach etlam misalkuni eknani beitza beemtza ve'ani matzron l'kol ruach ve'eknani acharei kein l'chol tzad v'lo yichlu l'salkini min ha'mechza u'min ha'notar l'chol ruach hilka mehashem misalkinin lei. Right? Or is it basically what are you doing? You undersell one property to make it that Ezra will now be a bar metzra on. Right? What happens? Right? Yonatan wants to make it that Ezra will have claims over Yonatan in the field. So what does he do? He sells off not the property that Yonatan wants, but part of his own property to Ezra for cheap. Yeah. No, it's his thing, right? What is he doing? Right? He sells off his own property to Ezra to make it that Ezra will be the bar metzra. So the Gemara says, look, if he sells his own property for cheap, so then he would sell it to anybody, so that's fine. And now Ezra is the bar metzra and can buy the second field, right? But if not, this is their basic way of evading the laws of bar metzra.
Well, that thing that he bought, when he sells it like the internal thing, nothing to do with the actual price, that he sells something internal, that there are no neighbors, just the guy comes down, she'll sell with the neighbors, or sell the rest of it. But does that make a price up? Like the case where it says that he's like doing a trick to establish it as a neighbor. But just that if he tells us. No, the Gemara is saying in a case where he undersells it, we have to look if he's really underselling it just because he wants to undersell it, or he's creating the case you're talking about. Right? He's underselling it in order to create a case of
neighborhood.
Why would that make a difference if it's an external case?
What do you mean?
Like, if somebody's done with cases that neighbors a bunch of people, then why does it matter that he's selling it in cents or cheap, just so he can have something later?
Right, meaning because if he's doing this to evade the laws of Bar Metzra, that's a problem. Right, because he's not really, so the Gemara assumes that he's not really selling it, right? What's he doing? He's selling it to him so that you won't be able to, right? You'll be able to buy everything else without someone making a claim against you. What? Okay. Now the Gemara brings up another case. Matana litbe mishum. Yeah.
So for the case where he sells it for
right. We assume that if you're just trying to evade the laws of Bar Metzra, we don't let you do that.
In the case where selling for 200, what's actually worth 100? They say that has chili up, you can't get a bad deal. You can change that on, right? Or is this later?
No, that's later. I think. Yeah. So then the Gemara says matana. What about a gift? Litbe mishum Dina D'Bar Metzra. A gift. There is no halacha-theory D'Bar Metzra. Why not?
Because it's not someone. If you just want to give a present to someone, you can't be forced to give a present to your neighbor.
Right. Exactly. Right. Meaning, and you can't be forced to turn it down. Right. Meaning, there's no reason that Yaakov shouldn't be able to give his property as a present to Ezra if he wants. And Yonatan can't say, well, I was willing to buy it. Ezra, don't take it. Right? Don't take it as a gift so that I can buy it off Yaakov. That doesn't work that way. For obvious reasons. Just think about it. Right? That makes no sense. Yeah. Yonatan. Yeah.
Why does that make sense if we're going along? If you're thinking that there's actual moral
Very good. So Yonatan asked the right question, which is if you go, this might be a proof to what we said before, is that, right, we said that the question of kinyan either is just exactly the same question as before. Is this law or not law? Or is it a even more pointed question of do you have the right of first acquisition or actually a right in the property? Once you say that matana doesn't have Dina D'Bar Metzra, so it's much harder to say that latter formulation, because if I own it in some way, then I have rights to it, right? And that might push us back in the direction of saying, no, really, all these questions are on the same axis over and over, right? Which is, to what extent is this law, to what extent is it not law? You're right? But it could be that you don't know that until this stage. Amar Abmeimar, Rikatev le'achrayos, is maybe Mishum Dina D'Bar Metzra. If he wrote achrayut, what's achrayut? It's a lien, meaning that if Yaakov's creditors come and claim the property from Ezra in payment of Yaakov's debt, that Yaakov promises to provide new land to Ezra, the Gemara says that's called a sale. Nobody gives a present and says, if they collect on the present and use it to pay my debt, I'll give you a new present. That's not how things work. That's a sale, right? Well, the Gemara says we assume it was a sale because no one would do that. No one would say, what? Right? The Gemara, right? The way Rashi says it, we just assume that it was a sale. Yeah, exactly. Right? Because no one's going to do that. No one's going to say, I'll give you $1 million gift, and if someone collects it, don't worry, I'll give you another $1 million gift. It doesn't work. Right? We've just upped the value of all of Yaakov's property. Yesterday it was $500,000, but we've moved him now from Milwaukee to New York. So now all his properties have doubled in value, or gone up 40 times in value, as he said. Properties are $27,000 or whatever. Yeah.
It sounds like if you sell internal stuff, then that's fine, right? If you sell if there's no neighbors, if I were to sell a chunk in the middle of my property, then you problem with selling the entirety of your property beyond like a 1-inch border around it to someone, and because that actual plot of land you're selling only borders your own land and there's no neighbors? I mean, getting around the curve of the law from a.
Okay, you got to try that one more time. I need to visualize this. One more time, yeah?
So if you sell the entirety of your property, besides like a 1-inch margin around the entirety or half off whatever, whatever small unit you can do, would to someone who's not your neighbor, would that be according to Dina D'Bar Metzra, would that be completely valid? Because the actual property that you're selling doesn't actually need for anything; it's all internal.
Yeah, presumably.
Okay, so you could do that and then give the rest of it as a matana, you feel like?
I mean, you could do that, yeah.
Okay.
So then the Gemara says, what about machar kol nechosav le'echad litbei mishum Dina D'Bar Metzra? What if you sell all your property together to one person? So then the Gemara says, there is no claim of Dina D'Bar Metzra. Why not? Right. So one might be that this might be another proof that it's not a claim in the actual property. Very good, right? Which is why, in the end of the day, I don't know if I would take that formulation, right? I was suggesting it. I was pointing out that at that stage of the Gemara, it could be a suggestion. But you're right. If you thought it was an actual claim in the property, it shouldn't matter. But now going back to our original question of, okay, is it a description of the law or is it law? So what do you think? Right, the fact that we only enforce Dina D'Bar Metzra when Yaakov is only selling one property. But if Yaakov says, look, I'm making aliyah, I'm selling all my properties, all my 40 acres of land in various places around Milwaukee, I'm selling all of it to who, and if one person's willing to take it, I'm going to sell it to go buy myself a house in, where do you want to live? If not Milwaukee. What? In Caesarea with all the rich and famous, okay? In Savayon, I don't know, in Herzliya Patuach, okay? Yeah, these are random rich places in the country, yes. Caesarea is where, like, Bibi's, like, private house is, you know, and Herzliya Patuach is, like, one of the richest areas in the country. And, I don't know, Savion also. I don't know. Take your pick. I don't care. This is a theoretical. I don't know. You're making so much out of a theoretical here. What? No, it doesn't matter why he's selling it. The point is he's selling everything. Because I don't know. He doesn't want to. I don't know why he's selling all of it. Fine, I don't know. He did sketchy things and he wants to hide it, so he just wants to sell it and run away. I don't know, right? I don't know, right? He won the lottery and wants to go into tax exile until he can manage to collect everything from it without paying taxes. I don't know why he's doing this, because he's doing it, okay? Right? So then we say he's allowed to sell it. We don't have to ask the neighbors, right? And the neighbors have no claim. So now, why not? So one way would be to say, good. So one way to say it would be, well, maybe Dina D'Bar Metzra functions to the level of moral values, and in this point, now you have a tension between the convenience of the neighbor and the convenience of the seller. And when you have, legitimate claims of convenience on both sides, so then, we just let them cancel it out. If you wanted to say that Dina D'Bar Metzra is formal law, so then what would you have to say? Or if you want to say Dina D'Bar Metzra is law, how would you legitimate this? And you have to add just one thing, which is everything we just said, and you have to add one more claim, which is a very little claim, but you realize you just need to do this, which is because there is no moral claim, Chazal chose not to make the takana, right? Meaning if you think it's formal, right? Then you have to say that they chose not to make the takana. And who says what I just said? Hint, you only have one rishon on the page. I've only given you one rishon. So who said the latter? Rashi. I just gave you Rashi just because it was cut out with it. But you can see Rashi says, Shelo tiknu chachamim l'lokech le'istalik l'asad yeshvatov l'vata meitzer shuhura l'mocher, because they just didn't make the takana in a case in which it will disadvantage the seller. Shezelo yikna ashar sheyimshach hayado b'shvil zu v'makom pseida democher lo Ziring Dina D'Bar Metzra. When it's going to cause a loss to the seller, Chazal just didn't institute the rule at all. Meaning, if you think that Dina D'Bar Metzra is just a moral claim, so then you just say, there is no moral tension here. The opposite. There's a moral tension, and therefore we say, look, there's claims on both sides, do whatever you want. But if you say it's law, so then you got to go just a half a step further, which is to say that Chazal looked back at the rationale and said, in this case, it doesn't make sense, because there are competing moral claims. They're completing legitimate claims, and therefore we just don't make the takana. But if you think that bar metzra is law, then you need to add that because there's no moral claim, Chazal chose not to make the takana. But they could have made the takana, and we'll see this, right? And as Yonatan and I talked about, it is possible that it might still be, right, if you take the latter approach, or if you take the former approach, then presumably Chazal are making a statement. There is no moral reason for you to do this. But if you take the formal approach, you could say, look, Chazal don't force you. But maybe it's the right thing to do for the buyer to forego that one property in favor of the neighbor who wants it. Right? Or not, I don't know. Okay. What about Zavan Me'akum? V'Zavan Le'akum. Litbe Mishum Dina D'Bar Metzra. If you buy it from a Jew, from a non-Jew, or to a non-Jew, you sell it to a non-Jew, there is no Dina D'Bar Metzra. Zavan Me'akum. Why if you buy it from a non-Jew? Very good. Because Ezra will say to Yaakov, listen, I bought it to be a nice guy, right? I know how much your neighbor caused trouble to you, to Yaakov. I didn't buy it because I wanted it. I just bought it to be a nice guy. And once I did that, that gives you the right to, right? That gives you a right. What? Yeah, exactly. Zavan le'akum, and if he sold it to the non-Jew, well, the Gemara just says, akum vadelav barvasida yasharatovu. You have no claim, moral or legal, that would force the non-Jew to keep up with supererogatory principles. That just doesn't fly. Yeah. Ezra, Yoho.
But this is still saying that you should sell it to the non-Jew, but it's just not actionable.
Oh, yeah. In general, there are all types of problems with selling to that's a different sugya, though.
But from whatever, in addition to the fact that you sell to the non-Jew, from the fact that you are not following the environment.
Right, well, that's the Gemara's next line. I should have read the next line. But if Yaakov sells the land to a nefarious neighbor, so we can't turn to that non-Jew and say, what? Or whatever. We can't say, Dina D'Bar Metzra, but we can say, you shouldn't have done that, and we put you in cherem until you take responsibility for whatever damage will come for having brought in an unsavory character into our neighborhood.
But for just that's for the situation being non-Jew, but for it is still like a problem that you didn't sell to the neighbor, but it's just not actionable.
It's not actionable, correct. It's not actionable. And therefore we can't force the buyer. Because remember, Dina D'Bar Metzra is usually really focused on the buyer. And and Ezra's problem for having bought it and not let Yoho buy it. So the non-Jew buys it, we can't force it on him, but it wasn't a good situation. You shouldn't have created that situation. I don't want to get into the question here but there are good non-Jews in the world. Yes, but that's not what the Gemara is talking about clearly, right? The Gemara elsewhere The Gemara makes it very clear that the non-Jews they're dealing with who are buying property amongst Jews are not the type that you want as your neighbors, okay? The Gemara goes so far as to say that the reason that you need to, right, the Gemara, who's doing Daf Yomi? Any of you guys doing Daf Yomi? So like I think it's only like a week or two ago, we were doing the questions of when you are in a courtyard with one Jew and one non-Jew, do you need to, right, when there's a non-Jew within an Eruv, you have to be socher reshut, right? It means you have to do a legal rental of his property to allow you to build an Eruv. And now you're all wondering, really, we do that where I live? Yes, we actually do that where we live. You rent from every single non-Jew in the Eruv, and we have different mechanisms by which we do that, right? Because the Gemara already says you could do it from, you don't have to do it individually, you can do it from the Sarah ear. So either we do it from the mayor, or we do it from, in some places we think you can do it, some poskim think you can do it from the police chief or the fire chief, because under certain circumstances they could enter your property coercively, which is a bit of a questionable argument. To be fair, mayor is also questionable because, it's a democracy. So some people say, well, the reason you can make an Eruv by renting from the mayor is because of eminent domain. Other people say, no, eminent domain proves that you do own your property. It's just that they have the right to buy it from you if necessary. And that's why some poskim like Rav Shechter reject this whole thing and say, no, even where there's an Eruv, you're only allowed to carry in the public spaces where the mayor has the right to give you right to the property, right? They can let you have a block party, but even in an Eruv, you're never allowed to carry into non-Jewish homes because a mayor doesn't have the right to give that to you. That's only in the time of, tyrants, that they could give you the right to enter into someone else's property. So there are poskim like Rav Shechter who say, no, even when you have an Eruv, you can carry in public spaces, from Jewish houses into public spaces, but you can never carry into the non-Jewish homes. No. This is not about Rishus HaRabim. This is whenever you make an Eruv of any sort, you need Schirot Rishus. This is true of this is true of something that halachically is Rishut HaYachid. This is true of a Chatzer also. Right? If you have a Chatzer with a wall around the whole thing, you still need an Eruv Chatzerot to be allowed to carry in it. Yes. That doesn't mean your backyard. That's your backyard. A Chatzer, like a joint-owned property, like we've been talking about. Now, but my point was not that. My point was that the Gemara says that what happens if there is a Jew and a non-Jew in the Chatzer? So the Gemara says that if there are two Jews and one non-Jew, then you need to do Schirot Rishus. Right, Schirot Rishus. You need to rent it from the non-Jew in the property. But if it's one Jew and one non-Jew, you don't have to. Why? Because one Jew and one non-Jew will very rarely live in joint property, because the Jew is convinced that if he lives alone in a closed property with a non-Jew, the non-Jew will murder him. And therefore, it's a milted blow shchiach, it's very rare, and therefore we don't bother making a takana. But if there are two Jews, we're worried that because they each assume that the other Jew will protect them, or at least be aware of the crime, and therefore the non-Jew will be afraid to kill them. So therefore, it's a common occurrence for two Jews to share a property with a non-Jew, and therefore they need to do Schirot Rishut. That just shows you that the non-Jews the Gemara are assuming are buying property amongst the Jews are an unsavory lot. Okay? I have no idea. All I'm telling you is that the Gemara clearly assumes that the non-Jews here are an unsavory bunch. That's all I'm telling you. Because their entire cheshbon is the guy afraid to murder you? Clearly it's not a good situation. And therefore the Gemara says, look, I can't force said non-Jew to give up the property, but I can tell the seller, you shouldn't have done that, and I'm putting you in cherem until you deal with this problem. Okay? Yeah. Yes.
We said that it's like, you don't come from the property if they buy it from a non-Jew. But why would the buyer still have the buyer still, I think, would have an obligation to go to the neighbor and make sure that the neighbor is looking at the property.
Very good. So here's where the Gemara seems to say, yeah, but if we have an overarching desire that this property be bought by a Jew, then he doesn't even have to wait the time, right? It's basically like saying, look, it's burning down, and I can only enter it if I buy it, right? I don't have to wait to ask someone, do you want it so you can put out the fire? I'll put out the fire and claim it for myself. Right? That's essentially what the Gemara is saying. So, right. So it seems to be that the reason is that the Gemara thinks that then Ezra is less likely to go buy it. Right? Ezra is less likely to take care of this imminent danger the non-Jew if he thinks that he's not going to end up getting advantage from this, right, from this probably difficult, maybe dangerous transaction. And therefore we just say, let him keep it. And his claim to it is that he got rid of a danger in this Jewish community, and right, I assume that's part of it, is that, right, how much effort is Ezra going to put in? Ezra, how much effort are you going to put in to buy this property just to get this dangerous person out of the neighborhood if you know that you're going to put in all the effort, and then Yonatan is going to turn around and say, yeah, but give it back to me, right? Okay, there you go. Yes.
So the question I had before.
Maybe Ezra would do it. Ezra's really nice. I wouldn't do it. Okay.
It was on, there's like a gap between like the first page and the second page, right, where we didn't have it in the Gemara, but I read it. So, if there's like if it's for the change of price, if it's if you buy it for 200, but it's only value at 100, it's like I think it's like
I thought there was something missing. Right. I didn't give you the whole thing. That makes sense. I was like, it's very weird to me to be that nice. So it just didn't process that I wouldn't have given you the whole thing. But you're right. I was nice. I cut out part of the Gemara. You're right. I knew something didn't flow correctly. Yeah.
So I think one person says that because you're asking them to eat and stuff.
Correct. Yeah. Now I remember what I cut out for you. Yeah. I cut out the whole complicated discussion in the Gemara of, right, do we assume that you're acting as an agent, and what does that do in terms of overcharging, undercharging? Yeah. Yeah. Now I remember why I cut it out, because I didn't want to get into that. That's what I didn't want to get into, was that endless thing. Yes.
So the entire concept of Dina D'Bar Metzra in a case where it's in a case where the neighbor would be willing to match the price of whatever the other person is offering for it, then how could you even entertain the thought that the neighbor should only have to pay 100? Like if you're saying you act like if the neighbor's only willing to pay 100 from this guy who bought for 200, that means he's giving up.
I'm sorry. It's just this guy and that guy is getting confusing because I was lost. You need to get like too many pronouns and vague references and stuff.
If buyer buys it for 200, neighbor would have. And we're saying neighbor is able to is possibly able to buy it for him for 100. How does that make any sense? Because the only Dina D'Bar Metzra is only in a case where the neighbor is willing to pay just as much as the buyer, right?
Again, right. Look, if you guys want, we can spend even more time on every halacha in Dina D'Bar Metzra. Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated because we got to figure out, right, what the Gemara is worried about there is special deals, right, is where I'm only selling it to you for this reason, and yeah, there's a presumption that the neighbor has rights, and therefore, in a case where Ezra goes and buys it, but he's going to have to give it to Yonatan, we conceptualize Ezra in a certain sense as Yonatan's shliach. But that doesn't necessarily work, right, under all circumstances. And if you... Yeah.
The case is you need a opinion for the guys or leaders, right? So let's say I'm willing to spend 200 and like actual value is doing something that the neighbor doesn't want to spend 200. So can you just like not do Kenyan and then like the land is like locked and the state is not being able to sold? Okay.
No.
So how does that work? Does the neighbor have to do something formal in order, like, let's say there's an actual like auction or something for the land, and the neighbor bets 100, bids 100, I bid 200, then would you have to actually do a Kenyan or something to let me buy it or not? Like, it's just that if we both bid 200, then it doesn't hit, right?
Right.
So if I
I'm not sure in that case if you need a kinyan or not. I'm not sure if you need a kinyan in that case.
Right, because if you don't need a kinyan for that, which it seems like you shouldn't. If you do need a kinyan for that, then you can just
I understand.
It is force is not.
Yeah, that doesn't really work. But I'm not sure if you need a kinyan in that case. I'd have to look.
And if he does just passively not take the opportunity to buy it, seems like it's comparable to the other case where I ask his permission, him just giving me permission.
Right. Again, I'd have to look at whether you need a kinyan there. I'm not sure. Okay. Then the Gemara asked this question, which really gets into very complicated issues about mashkanta, of security. So I'm going to skip this for a little bit, unless you guys are really interested in getting to the depths of mashkon. Then the Gemara says, Limkor berachok, v'legol b'karov, b'ravel g'v'yafe, lit b'mishum Dina D'Bar Metzra. If you're selling far away to buy close lands, so there's no Dina D'Bar Metzra. Because the seller wants to get rid of it so that he can, be closer and, whatever, we let him do it. We don't make him wait around for the neighbor. Let's skip down to, okay, I want to show you one more case. Look at Shchenei Ha'ir. Shchenei Ha'ir u'Shchenei Sadeh, Shchenei Ha'ir Kodman. If you have neighbors to the city or neighbors to the field, so the neighbors of the city are first. Shachen v'Talmid Chacham, Talmid Chacham Kodem. Karo v'Talmid Chacham, Talmid Chacham Kodem. If it comes between a scholar and a neighbor, the scholar comes first. Yiboyelu Shachen v'Karov, what if it's a neighbor versus a relative? Tashma, Tov Shachen Karov Me'ach Rachok. A brother a neighbor is better than a brother, so the neighbor comes first. Okay, what's going on in that Gemara? Yeah, thank you. So there is a machloket rishonim here, whether this halacha has anything to do with Dina D'Bar Metzra or not. Meaning, is this a halacha on Dina D'Bar Metzra that if it comes down to a Talmid Chacham or a neighbor, the Talmid Chacham doesn't have to respect the rights of Dina D'Bar Metzra? Or that you have to take in Talmid Chacham into account when you're talking different neighbors or something like that? Or whether you can sell to a relative over a shachen, etc. One possibility. Or does this halacha have nothing to do with Dina D'Bar Metzra? And Dina D'Bar Metzra, obviously, the only person who has any advantage is the neighbor. And this Gemara just happens to show up here, but it's part of the more general discussion that we have in many places in halacha, like by tzedakah, where there are certain levels of priority of who you give to. But by Dina D'Bar Metzra, there is no advantage to a Talmid Chacham over anybody else. Very good. So what's the lumdish question there? So the Rishonim who think that this is Dina D'Bar Metzra, they think that, look, even within Dina D'Bar Metzra, it might be that the right thing to do is to sell to your neighbor. But we have other guiding principles in life of priority. And if Dina D'Bar Metzra comes into conflict with those, so then those might win out. Or it's built into Dina D'Bar Metzra. I mean, when we were formulating Dina D'Bar Metzra, we didn't only take in the neighborly rights, we took in a broader picture of our responsibilities to society. But if you think that, no, that's impossible, when it comes to Dina D'Bar Metzra, that can't be the case. Maybe in other cases, we have preference for Talmidei Chachamim, we have preference, but when it comes to Dina D'Bar Metzra, that's not the case, then what's that shita saying? That shita is saying, look, this particular law of Dina D'Bar Metzra is, right, the added value of owning consecutive properties is such that what? Right? Such that the right thing to do is always to grant it to the neighbor. Right? And the fact that other people have external moral claims on you, but they aren't inherent in this local property, right, that doesn't affect the fact that Dina D'Bar Metzra is a localized halacha. So that question, or the question of whether this is a Dina D'Bar Metzra halacha, I think, is whether the way you think about Dina D'Bar Metzra is about a basic overarching responsibility to society where I can balance Vasiti V'Ashmatov and I can balance other competing moral values. Or do we say, no, Dina D'Bar Metzra is a localized question of just from property rights perspective, who has the highest level moral claim to this property? And whether someone's a Talmid Chacham or relative, whatever, is completely irrelevant to this conversation, right? So that is a machloket rishonim here. Okay. I think, why don't we just leave Rashi and Tosafot for tomorrow, and that'll be the last day on this sugya. Even though Dina D'Bar Metzra, even though it is really just this one amud, as you saw, I cut out some of the Gemara, and I didn't give you 90% of the material in Dina D'Bar Metzra, because all these different cases come in Dina D'Bar Metzra of, right, there are all types of complications in Dina D'Bar Metzra of, if you have four neighbors who are neighbors on one field, how do you deal with that, right? Competing neighborly claims, and things like percentage claims, right? Like if two people border it, and this is what Tosafot is going to start talking about a little bit in Bava Basra, if you have multiple people neighboring, but one neighbor is at 10% and one 90%, right? It's not a perfect, right? Not a perfect grid, but it's like a jigsaw puzzle. So then you have more rights based on a higher percentage in the field, and right, all types of complexities that come up in Dina D'Bar Metzra, I didn't deal with. But as you see, that at least some of these questions here in the Gemara force us to push the questions we talked about yesterday a little bit further, test out some theories, reject some theories. And yes, we did skip over the part of the Gemara where it seems clear that Dina D'Bar Metzra is, the way it was formulated is in a very specific way, that we conceptualize the buyer as a coerced shliach of the neighbor, and all the implications that has to do in terms of prices and stuff like that. If you guys want, we can spend an extra day and just go through the pricing issues. I felt like we should try to get the basics of the sugya and not get bogged down in the details of Dina D'Bar Metzra, because it could take us forever. I know Ezra was interested in those questions, but I don't think we're going to have time. Right? I'd like to tomorrow do Rashi and Tosafot, and maybe one more nafkamina here that I gave you from the Balamor, and basically move on. And again, with the disclaimer that yes, there's a lot left in Dina D'Bar Metzra that we didn't do, but at least the main questions I want to deal with, which is understanding the ways in which law, right, value can be formulated into law, and the different ways we can do that, and localized values and things like that, we can, we've dealt with.